A navy blue cap flattened. I remember scraping blood from its silver badge. That day they came with his watch, his cap, his baton, his whistle, his bloody relics. The rest lay plastered cold, in neat patches bullet holed, freshly laid for the family to kiss and a parade.
Since the 1960s, a nasty, brutal and violent parallel universe has evolved in Ireland. It's an underworld where all the vices are satisfied at a terrible price, where power is seized by force, maintained through fear and lost to the assassin's bullet. Here life is cheap and the wages of sin are irresistibly tempting. This is the dark world of gangland. Its grip has demoralized neighborhoods and destroyed many lives. This is the world of organised crime, where no holes are barred, everything is fair game, and the spoils go to the most ruthless. Welcome to Bad Fellas.
The bodies of the two latest victims of the country's gangland and gun culture were this afternoon removed from the house at Scribblestown Park in Finglas, where they were brutally murdered this morning.
Most of those who feel vulnerable and insecure are ordinary law-abiding citizens, people doing their best to make a go of life. They are the ones who suffer first and the most at the hands of organised crime.
Martin Marlowe Hyland, one of the biggest, if not the biggest drug dealer in the country, was the gunman's target. But 20-year-old Anthony Campbell was also shot dead, a young man doing an honest day's work.
I remember when they released his body and his hand, he obviously put his hand up to protect himself, so he knew. Do you know what I mean? And that's always going to live with me. What was his last moments like, how frightened he was. You know, that's something I live with daily. To have your child murdered is just... I can't even explain it because the pain is that great. I don't think anyone can understand it until it's happened to you.
The double murders of gang boss Marlowe Hyland and innocent plumber Anthony Campbell sticks out in people's minds. But nearly 200 others have been gunned down in gangland hits since the year 2000. Bad Fellas will tell the story of how organised crime took root in Ireland since the 1960s. It's a story of how guns and narcotics arrived on the streets and changed the face of Irish society. It is a story without an end in sight.
Proportionately speaking, about 5 times as many gun killings occur in Ireland than do in comparable countries such as England and Wales or in Scotland. So there is legitimate concern about the levels of gun killings in Ireland.
It's very simple. People get into organised crime because big money to be made. Some people get in at the small end and suddenly it just grows and grows, and the next thing they're high up in the pyramid and they're subject to the disciplines and to the threats of death and the possibility of actually being murdered because they have lost money or lost a shipment or even just pure suspicion that they're talking to somebody.
Drugs underlie so much of the murder and mayhem that we have on the streets, the high level of murders. It has to do with internecine gang rivalries, falling out with one another, double-crossing one another, stealing one another's shipments and loads of drugs. It's hard to find a murder that actually wouldn't be attributable to drugs in some way.
I would say number one priority is organised crime because it's such a blight and a cancer on our society. And if it's not checked, it'll spread throughout the country. It's like any cancer, it'll grow and grow and grow.
Organised crime is big business in Ireland. According to the Health Research Board, the drugs trade alone is worth €5 million a day. That's €1.8 billion every year.
Earlier this year, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime described organised crime globally as the new superpower. For example, heroin into Europe alone was about 20 billion and counterfeiting into Europe was about 10 billion.
Irish organised crime is just part of a vast, shadowy global enterprise. In America, the underworld's colossal financial clout has long been seen as a sinister force to be reckoned with.
In the mid-90s, a former president, Bill Clinton, referred to it as a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States, and that has only developed further and has gotten worse. Just one group, La Cosa Nostra, in the United States alone was estimated to make over $100 billion in 1 year from illegal gambling. When you consider the other groups that are involved, Russian organized crime groups, Irish organized crime, Asian and Balkan groups, then you consider the other criminal activities, drug trafficking, prostitution, counterfeiting, and cyber crimes. The numbers are astronomical.
The level of organised crime in Ireland has become so serious that in cities like Limerick, the wealth, power and fear generated by warring crime gangs has threatened and undermined the commercial and social cohesion of the city. There is a pervasive feeling that even if you mind your own business, you're not safe. And if you do stand up for your civil rights, be prepared to pay a very high price.
Roy Collins' family ran a number of pubs in Limerick City. The victim was shot after two gunmen entered the amusement arcade which adjoins the Steering Wheel pub in Roxborough shopping centre shortly after noon. The victim's family had been subjected to gangland violence in the past. The first cousin of Mr Collins' was threatened and shot in one of their pubs in December 2004 after he refused entry to a 14-year-old girl. Wayne Dundon, a member of the McCarthy-Dundon faction heavily involved in Limerick's feud, was subsequently jailed for 10 years for threatening the man, but no one has been convicted for the shooting.
We gave evidence like to put the leading member of the McCarthy-Dundon gang away, and that wasn't going to be left go. I thought it was. I thought it kind of got it, but we were wrong. Like they wanted to get back at us for that, like, and that's what happened. Life as we know it is non-existent now. Being followed by Gardaí everywhere you go. You can't socialise. We'll have a sentence for the rest of our life of looking over our shoulders, of being protected by Gardaí, and it's no life really.
The murder of law-abiding citizens by crime gangs to deter witnesses and scare juries has eroded many people's faith in the capacity of the Irish state to protect their freedoms and civil liberties.
These people are just making life hell for decent, ordinary people in particular geographic areas of the country. People, if they think that it's going to stay in Limerick and stay in certain parts of Dublin and not extend out into the rest of the country, they're being incredibly naive.
To tell the story of how and why organised crime took hold in Ireland, we must go back to the 1960s. Although no one realised it at the time, it was the twilight of an age of superficial innocence. A safe, secure, stable society, almost crime-free, where bicycles went unlocked and hall doors were left open.
The Guards are an impressive force, big men, suggesting bogland scenes in the centre of gas and petrol fumes, suggesting also comfort and stability.
You had a baton, a whistle and perhaps a torch. There were very few patrol cars. There was one patrol car in the Store Street district and there was one plainclothes car for detectives.
You had closely knit communities where the same families knew one another for generations and where they could put pressure on younger people to behave themselves. And I'm sure the church, who gets blamed for so many things, probably would claim some credit for the way things were.
When I arrived from Templemore in the Dublin city in 1965, it was a pretty stable conservative society. Serious crime was virtually unheard of. Certain amount of violence, bad rows outside pubs, that type of thing. Some people carried knives. Guns were most unusual.
In 1966, there were only 4 murders in Ireland. None of them involved guns.
There were break-ins into shops, larcenies from various types of warehouses and stores, and There was some pickpocketing and bicycle thefts, and that was the main type of crime that occurred.
Well, I practiced law in Limerick throughout the 60s. There was really very little crime at all, and I can recall that at the start of circuit court sittings, the county registrar would stand up and he'd present the judge with a pair of white gloves. And that was to signify that there was no indictable crime in the city or county of Limerick. And that used to go on term after term. I don't think there have been white gloves in Limerick in the 80s, 90s, the noughties, or that there ever will be again.
Dublin once had many gunsmiths. Today, rods and guns can be bought in many places, but in the early part of the century, they were sold by specialists after long consultation.
Gun crime was very rare in Ireland in the 1960s, and not only was it very rare, the types of gun crime that occurred were very different to the types of offences that happen today. The offences that occurred in the 1960s usually involved parties that were known to each other, and usually it was some kind of strife, perhaps over a domestic incident or over land. But we're talking about crime figures in single figures in the 1960s.
From the mid-1960s, petty crime in Ireland was on the rise. The country was changing. The ties that bonded communities together began to slowly unravel. But serious crime was still a rarity. In the mid-60s, there were 300 prisoners in Irish jails. Today, there are over 4,000.
1966 is a good year to use as a starting point because it's the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and Irish society had by that time, I think, matured and settled down. In fact, the society had become so relatively safe and crime-free that there was discussion, real debate, serious debate, about whether or not we should close down some prisons. So you can take it almost as the last point of normality, because 3 years later, of course, you had the outbreak of violence in the north of Ireland.
The 60s was an era of ferment. The Vietnam War and the American civil rights struggle radicalized a generation of students across the world. This turmoil spawned urban guerrilla groups committed to armed revolt. The Baader Meinhof Gang, the Weather Underground, the Red Brigades. All believed power came from the barrel of a gun. In Ireland, these currents created a faction called Saor Éire. Saor Éire would change the face of crime in Ireland by bringing in the gun.
What you had was an